But they'll probably have
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, Rabbi.
We're learning Mishnah Yisika, Parak Dalet, Chapter 4, Mishnah Vav, Mishnah 6. The Mishnah is continuing with the discussion of the mitzvah of the Arava, which, as we learned before in the previous Mishnah, they would take the Arava, walk around the Mizbeach, and then put it up next to the Mizbeach, next to the altar. So now the Mishnah continues, K'maseu b'chol, the same way they perform this mitzvah during the week. Kach ma'aseu b'Shabbos. That's how they performed it on Shabbos. Ella, rather, except the difference is though, shoyumalaktin oisan me'erev Shabbos. They had to gather them from before Shabbos. During the week, they basically picked them fresh. Before they were to use them, they went down to this area where they grew, and they picked them. They cut them down, and they used them. You couldn't, first of all, cut them down before Shabbos. You couldn't cut them down on Shabbos. You couldn't carry them on Shabbos. And therefore, Shabbos, they would gather them from before Shabbos and bring them to the Beis HaMikdash, and and they would place them in golden barrels, in order that they shouldn't wither. Meaning if they stay out of water, they're going to dry up, they're going to wither. But by sticking them into water, they'll stay fresh. They can be fresh for the mitzvah the next day. The fact that they were golden barrels was more about the honor given to the mitzvah. So that's the difference. The difference between the mitzvah Arava being done during the week and on Shabbos is the fact that the gathering of the Aravis had to be done from before Shabbos. They were put into water to stay fresh for the next day when the mitzvah was done. Now we're going to have an opinion that basically says everything we've been talking about until now, forget about it. Rabbi Yechim ben Broika says, they didn't bring Aravis. No, they did not use Aravis. They used Chariyah Shaldeker. Chariyah Shaldeker are hardened palm branches. Now, hardened palm branches means like this. I read to you from the notes. Sometimes a palm branch is called a lulav, right? And sometimes, or lulavim, and sometimes it's called chariyas in plural. Chariyas refer to palm branches that were left on the tree until their spines hardened like wood. Spine meaning there's that, in your lulav, you see that thicker green leaf that goes most of the way up the lulav, right? So they left that on the tree until their spines hardened like wood, and their leaves spread out and stiffened, like a good old palm tree. So basically, a chariyas is a lulav that stayed on the tree longer than we leave it on the tree, so that it should harden and spread out. So what they did was chariyas shaldekal hayamavian, meaning besides for the lulav that you did the mitzvah with, they would bring these hardened palm branches, and they would beat them on the ground at the side of the altar. Now this sounds a little bit like when we hit the Aravis. That's our custom, as we said. But according to Yechim ben Broika, there was no taking the Aravis and walking around. They took these palm branches, and they beat it on the ground next to the altar. And that day, the day that this was performed, which actually was every day of Sukkot, it was performed every day. Nikra Yom Chibet HaChariyas. It was called the day of the beating of the branches. That's what they called it, which was really every day of Sukkot. So according to Yechim ben Broika, again, there was no mitzvah done with an Arava. It wasn't about Aravis. It was about taking these chariyas, these dried palm branches, and beating them on the ground next to the altar. Martinura says, "Ve'ein halach Rabbi Yechim ben Broika." We do not follow his opinion. We follow the opinion that it was the Aravis they took around, and although we haven't seen in the Mishnah, there was what's called, which we learned yesterday, was called a minik hanavim, a custom instituted by the prophets to bang the Aravis on the ground. Okay, now let's do the next Mishnah. Mishnah Zion, Mishnah 7. Miyad hatinoikos shomten esulaveyan va'echlin esregeyan. Short Mishnah. Okay, there's a lot to this Mishnah, and there's a lot of interpretations to it. So, the interpretation I'm going to work with is the following: Miyad. What does the word miyad mean? It also means immediately. right? It can mean miyad means from the hand. It could also mean immediately. So the commentary of the Meiri, he learns that miyad means immediately, meaning on the seventh day after they finish doing the mitzvah. Immediately, once they finish doing the mitzvah, the tanoikas, the children would remove or slip out their lulavim, meaning we know the lulavim were tied with the arabis and the hadassim. So once the mitzvah was done, the little children would now basically slip the lulav out from being held together with the hadassim and the arabis. And what would they do with it? They would play with it. I'll read it to you from here. Rush defines the word shemton as slip or slide out. Thus he states that the children would slip the lulav away from the willow twigs to which it was bound, and they would then play with the lulavim, since they are long and fun to play with. As long as they don't hit each other with it. They would also make rings out of the lulav leaves and play with them. You know, in those days, you were very, very, very resourceful. Okay, but that's what they did. Okay, that's what they did. And actually, this wasn't meant to be any kind of a way of disgracing the mitzvah. It was really a way of, basically the mitzvah was done. Now the children would have joy with it in a certain way that they could appreciate more. And they would eat their esregim. They would eat their esregim. Why not? Something wrong with that? We don't eat esregim so much, but it's pretty clear, right? An esrog, the esrog is described as a fruit that's eaten. It clearly was a fruit that was eaten. Okay, so they would eat the esregim. Eat the esregim also was a sign of, I'm done with the mitzvah, but now I'm going to show my how do I call it? My endearment for this. I'm going to eat it, right? It was done for a mitzvah, and I'm just going to throw it out. I'm going to eat it. But what's important is, as is pointed out by the Mefarshim, by the commentaries, that it says, and they ate their esregim. Who's their esregim? Now we talked about the lulavim of the children. Yeah. And the esregim, we'll be going on the children's esregim. Meaning children who were old enough to be trained in the mitzvah, they had a lulav, they had an esreg. Once the mitzvah was done, they were finished with the mitzvah on the seventh day. They did what they did to the lulavim, and they ate their esregim. Who ate it? Could be anybody ate it, but it was specifically eating their esregim. Why is that? So I'm ready to again here. Rashi, now, because the point is like this. A esreg, right, has a degree of muktzah to it. Remember, these are muktzah. It's set aside. Now, typically on Shabbos, muktzah means you can't move it. Okay? You can move an esrog on Sukkot, but you can't use it for any other purpose than the mitzvah. You can't use it for any other purpose. This article has been set aside to be used as a mitzvah. You cannot now benefit it from any other way. Meaning, in essence, if this is meant for a mitzvah, you can't use it for anything else. Okay? Which means, okay, I'm not going to get into it. We won't get into the specifics right now. But you can't use it for anything else. The thing is, though, but once I'm finished doing the mitzvah, I'm finished, right? I did it already. Day is over. The seventh day is done. I did it on the seventh day. Mitzvah's over. Shouldn't be muktzah anymore, right? Wrong. Because there is a concept that once something is muktzah for part of a day, it's muktzah for the rest of the day. That we have that in Hilchos Shabbos, we have that very often. Once it's muktzah l'miktzas hayom, it's muktzah l'kula yom. Once it's been set aside for part of the day, it's set aside for the rest of the day. Which means that on the seventh day, even though you're finished doing the mitzvah, you still can't have benefit from it, because until you did the mitzvah, you couldn't have benefit from it. So the rest of the day, it's the same. But the children's esregim were different, because since the children's mitzvah was at a lower level, because it was not to fulfill a Torah obligation, but to follow a obligation of being trained. That kind of mitzvah, we don't say it's set aside to the point that it's going to be forbidden for the whole day. And therefore, once they finished doing the mitzvah, they ate the esregim because they could. Because the children's esregim didn't have that status of being muktzah for the whole day. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Did they feel them? Or they